Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have questions after this session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Welcome. I am Dr. Frank Sobchak, and today we are extremely fortunate to have with us Michael Gordon for today's session, and we're going to talk about his latest book, Degrade and Destroy. Michael is the national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Before joining the Journal, he was a correspondent for the New York Times for 32 years, serving as both the bureau chief in Moscow from 1996 to 2000, and then later serving as the chief military correspondent. Michael has authored or co-authored 4 books on Iraq, 3 with late Bernard Traynor, a Marine Corps lieutenant general, and then 1 on his own. These 4 books together comprise the best, most complete explanation of the American military experience in Iraq. The 4 books start with Operation Desert Storm, America's first 1990s conflict with Iraq, with the Generals' War. Then he also wrote Cobra II, which covered the invasion in the early years of the Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then the Endgame, covering the final years of the conflict before the American withdrawal in 2011. His latest book is Degrade and Destroy, which covers the conflict against Daesh, or ISIS. And so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to you, Michael. We are very fortunate to have you with us today and are very honored by your opportunity to talk with us. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Frank. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this, and I very much respect the kind of work that you folks do. I've been with the U.S. military forces now in 6 wars, and 1 war, 7th war was with the Russian army. That's another story, in Chechnya. And so my process that I use to do my reporting for the New York Times and also to do my previous books is I would go and in bed when they had that procedure with U.S. forces for some extended period, see the reality on the battlefield as best I could. I'm a non-combatant. I would get as close to it as I could, come back to Washington, do reporting there, and try to combine the two and go back and forth between the battlefield and DC, where I live, and see what the realities are. And what I discovered was that if you were in DC, you didn't always know what was happening on the battlefield, and if you were on the battlefield, you didn't generally know what the policy options were within whatever administration was in power then. And that was the procedure that I adopted for my previous books. And when I undertook this book, I was basically covering the conflict for the New York Times, but it wasn't the easiest thing to do for one big reason. There was no embedding. There still isn't, by the way. I tried to embed with the 82nd Airborne to cover their mission in Europe as a deterrent to Russian aggression, and that's not allowed. I don't really see I think that's the Pentagon shooting itself in the foot through this policy, but that's the way it is. But in OIR, Operation Inherent Resolve, it didn't matter so much because the fighting was done by our partners, and they were happy for a Western correspondent to embed. So from the very start, I was able to go with Peshmerga, both when they liberated Sinjar in November 2015, and in the early phase of the Mosul operation in 2016. I was able to go with the CTS, the Iraq's Counterterrorism Service, in Western Mosul on 2 occasions. And I was also able to do something that they call a battlefield circulation, where you go with a general or a colonel, and you go on his meetings and interactions for a day. You're not fully embedded, but it gives you some degree of access. And from these kind of real world experiences and reporting afterwards, I was able to do kind of the base research for this book. Now, what I would like to do now is talk for about 10 or 15 minutes max, turn it over to Frank to ask his questions, and then give you an opportunity to ask whatever you want, because I'm always the guy throwing the questions at the military and civilians and government. So it's fair game, and you can ask whatever you want, and I'll respond as candidly as I can. But for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'll lay out sort of my principal themes in the book and what I concluded from this. First off, a point I always like to make is I feel that the U.S. government and the Pentagon is remiss in not doing a serious look at Operation Inherent Resolve. There is no official history of it. I don't even know of a serious attempt to do one. RAND has done one of the air war, and there are little bits and pieces here and there by the Asymmetric Warfare Group. There's a study on Mosul that's about 20 pages. Ash Carter, who I interviewed for this book and passed away tragically not so long ago, did a monograph, but there's not really a comprehensive look at this conflict by the military, by the Pentagon. I think that's unfortunate because this was a war that succeeded. It had its warts. It had there were things that didn't go right, but it was a successful campaign in which the U.S. and its partners largely vanquished the Islamic State at minimal cost to the United States. About 20 combat deaths, certainly a lot of ordnance expended, some substantial cost to civilians, but no lingering occupation duties. So in the annals of American intervention, I think this has to be counted as an accomplishment, all things considered. Second point I would like to make is one thing that I saw by covering this conflict for years, starting right after the fall of Mosul to ISIS in June 2014 and carrying really almost until the present, because it's still officially ongoing, Operation Inherent Resolve, is that the strategy evolved. There was not a set-piece strategy and procedure for how to carry out this war when the intervention began, because the U.S. had not anticipated needing to fight this war, notwithstanding the fact that the Delta Force commander and the SOCCENT commander had gone to Iraq and issued warnings in February 2014 that ISIS was on the rise and that the CTS were not able to handle it. Washington did nothing about that and was caught flat-footed when the Mosul fell into ISIS hands in June. And a lesson that I observed was that in the beginning, there were a lot of constraints put on the advise and assist mission, this partnership mission, which by, with, and through, as it's generally called now, that hampered the operation and slowed progress. For example, it really wasn't until the summer of 2016 that conventional forces were giving accompanying authority at the battalion level to go with Iraqi forces in the field. And it was when they bridged the Tigris in sort of preparing the march up to Mosul. That was really a necessary step. But the tardiness in giving this accompanying authority really slowed momentum and made it difficult to build traction. It reflected some initial caution in Washington about getting back into Iraq. But it's hard to fight a war if the advisors are confined to within the perimeters of large bases away from the action, which was the case for conventional forces, not for the Delta Force or the SOF elements. It wasn't really until December 2016 that General Townsend issued Tactical Directive Number 1 that made full use of the advisors and gave them sufficient leverage, for example, to call in airstrikes directly from the field instead of going to a strike cell in the rear, and allowed the Apaches to be employed more usefully and steps of that kind. So that was a long time coming. And in the book, I try to tell the story of that. Another takeaway, the plan, however, and the model for how to do this war was essentially set by the end of 2016. That is, during the Obama administration. During the election campaign, candidate Trump talked about doing a lot of things, taking the wraps off, changing the strategy, applying force more decisively. But in fact, President Trump didn't change the strategy. President Trump implemented the strategy that was evolved during the Obama administration. The rules of engagement were not changed. None of those things that were talked about during the campaign actually happened. It succeeded not because of the politicians in Washington, but because of the efforts of our partner forces, and I think the judgments and skill of the U.S. and its coalition partners. But the essential strategy was set in really by the end of 2016. Of course, the big dramas were still to come, West Mosul and and Raqqa. A third point that I try to make is, well, so what? That's not probably a question you ask, since you're in the business of special operations and force. But I argue that the OIR experience is relevant in a number of respects. First off, we've all seen the national defense strategy that the Biden administration put out, which is very similar to the one that was put out in 2018 by the Trump administration, just a little rebranding here and there. There's a very terse, in the unclassified version, discussion of how to handle places like the Middle East, which is that, well, we're going to rely on partners and allies more and kind of mitigate the threats that way, but it's not really extensive. And so if one looks toward the future, yes, I understand the pivot toward great power competition, or what is now known as integrated deterrence, and the emphasis on the pacing threat in China and the more ephemeral acute threat in Russia. I used to live in Russia. But all these dangers in the ungoverned spaces in the Middle East and South Asia and other places are not going to mysteriously vanish. And forever is a very long time. So to say that we're never going to do this again, I think is myopic. It's some of the mistakes that were made after Vietnam, when people turned away from counterinsurgency. So I do think some variation of by, with, and through, and which was done on an industrial scale against ISIS, and when they coupled massive air and ISR with small American footprint on the ground, some version is likely to be employed again. I can't say precisely when and where, and of course it's still ongoing in Syria and Iraq to this day. A second big thought I have is that I do think that in a by, with, and through might have utility even in a great power context. And if one looks at the Ukraine conflict, and I've been focusing a lot in that today, you could argue that that's a version of by, with, and through. Yes, we don't have advisors on the ground. And yes, we're not doing the airstrikes, but a lot of what enabled the Ukrainian forces to be proficient was the training that was done beforehand by the 10th Special Forces Group, and the relationships, extensive relationships between American forces in Europe and the Ukrainian commanders, and with advice, intelligence sharing. Obviously, we're supplying many of the munitions along with our allies and giving the means to carry out the fight. And so I think there's a role for some attenuated version of by, with, and through in a great power context, particularly when it's against an adversary that's a nuclear power, has an extensive nuclear arsenal, whom we don't want to confront directly, but whose aggression needs to be resisted. Lastly, and I don't want to not show the slides the 4 slides I prepared. But lastly, how does one do this mission effectively? Well, partly it's involved. You have to be in the field with the forces to see what's your partner forces, to experience what they're experiencing, get a better understanding and feel for the battlefield, be able to call in air more responsibly. You can't do it remotely and at distance. But there's some other lessons I saw, and a lot of this I saw firsthand. The building of relationships was absolutely essential. And one of the things that happened, because we were coming back to Iraq, is the SOF and the conventional force commanders had relationships on the Iraqi side that they were able to rekindle and draw on. General Townsend knew Abdul Amir, who was the Iraqi commander for Mosul from their previous deployments. I mean, those sorts of things just rippled across the battlefield, where Americans were dealing with Iraqis who they had done in past tours and incarnations. And those relationships are key. They can't be invented on the spot. And that's what gives me a little bit of pause when the NDS says, we'll just use SOF and partners and we'll mitigate all the dangers that way. That's nice, but you have to develop these relationships in peacetime if you're going to draw on them when in war. Second of all, if you're going to have a by, with, and through relationship with these kind of forces, you can't order them around. It just doesn't work that way. They don't take orders from us. They're doing the fighting and the dying. And they wanted to retake Fallujah. We thought hey, that we don't need to do that. We got Ramadi. Let's go back up to Mosul. Sorry. They decided it was important, and we had to respect that. But you can build influence and credibility with them and try to influence their decision making behind the scenes. And so I'm going to now turn to the slides for 5 minutes, and then we're going to shift to Frank. So can we just go to closer to the first slide? So that's taken by Colonel Pat Work, now a general at the Pentagon. And he was then really the man in the field who interacted with Abdullah Mir and was at his hip for the West Mosul side of the operation. It's a photo he took, and I'm not proficient in Arabic, but basically it says, welcome to, welcome to the caliphate, welcome to Mosul, welcome to the caliphate holdings here. Let's go to the second slide, please. So this is the East Mosul campaign. It's kind of generic. It's what you do when you're putting together a book for a layman. This is an interesting example. You see those arrows there, the 16th IA, the CTS, the Federal Police, and then the 9th Division, all pointing into East Mosul. This is an example of the limits of American influence. When the East Mosul battle approached, the concept that was developed by Brett Sylvia, also a general now, then a colonel for the 101st, was that they should somehow find a way to integrate the Iraq's best forces, the CTS, the Iraqi army, and the federal police. And so there was a concept that the CTS would be in the lead, the federal police would follow because they had the numbers, and the federal the army, CTS would be in the lead, the Iraqi army would follow, and the federal police would be last, and they would stabilize. It was sort of an American projection of how the Iraqis might fight. Well, they didn't want to do it that way. That's just not how they operate. In Iraq, all of the federal police and the counterterrorism service and the Iraqi army all report to different ministries, and they don't they're not integrated in that way. And so they fought this way, and it didn't work that well. They were not mutually supporting. The CTS found themselves out in the lead. There was an episode where the 9th Armored Division pushed in and took the Al-Salam Hospital rather unexpectedly. It was a huge breakthrough, but then found themselves without support since no one else knew what they were doing, and had to beat a hasty retreat, which was a real setback for them. So East Mosul is an interesting example of the limits of American influence initially, and that's partly what led to General Townsend to promulgate Tactical Directive Number 1 to give the advisors more of a role in the battlefield. Next slide, please. This is a kind of very generic slide of the West Mosul fight. I had a limited number of maps in the book, and we went for this one. But when they got to West Mosul, which was the harder part of the operation, initially all the forces were attacking from the south, which is exactly what ISIS expected. And so they were kind of stymied by April, and I was out there, April 2017. And I, even though there was no embedding, and even though my access to internal deliberations was sort of hit and miss, through pure happenstance, and I just want to relate this story before I wind up, I ended up in a meeting. I was with General Townsend. I was doing a battlefield circulation. All the forces were coming up from the south at that juncture. They were stymied. And we were at Haman al-Alil. He was meeting various commanders, and we got word, oh, the prime minister's coming. And Townsend didn't know that. I certainly didn't know that. And there was a meeting in a big tent with martyrs on the wall. And it was basically a council of war with all the top Iraqi commanders. And I had a chapter on this in the book. And so I witnessed this. I sat behind General Townsend. I was wearing a collared shirt and khaki pants. I figured the Iraqis must have pegged me for some kind of POLAD or State Department type. I just kept my mouth shut and took notes. General Townsend turned around to me at one point early on in this meeting and passed me a note. And I kind of nodded sagely. I figured the Iraqis must have thought, oh, he's consulting with his State Department advisor. But actually, General Townsend's note said, the prime minister does not know you are here, a book only. And I nodded. because obviously you couldn't reveal the contents of this meeting immediately because of OPSEC considerations. It was all about future operations. And what I saw was just a pretty vociferous debate among the Iraqi top command, and everyone was pointing the finger at the other. The CTS said we're the only ones that are doing the fighting. The federal police commander said that the army's not doing anything at all, and they pushed back, and it ended inconclusively without Prime Minister Abadi, who was wearing the black uniform of the CTS, taking a decision to change the strategy, which was interesting. But within a matter of weeks, the slide you see there became the strategy, where a second front was opened up from the north, essentially, and the west. And how did that come about? Well, that was an American concept of how to unstick the fight in Western Mosul and how to come at ISIS at all sides. And the Iraqis were resistant of it because their 9th Armored Division had its nose bloodied in East Mosul. Nobody at this meeting spoke up for it, but General Townsend and then Colonel Pat Work and a whole host of people weighed in, the Iraqi counterparts, and made the case that if they opened a second front, Iraqi casualties would be greatly reduced. They presented an intelligence analysis to that effect, and it was all done behind the scenes, not in a public meeting, which might have embarrassed the prime minister and made him appear like a tool of the Americans, all behind the scenes so that they came to the conclusion. So what's the lesson? The lesson is, if you have credibility with your partner, if you have relationships with your partner, and if you've been at your partner's side in the battlefield, not just within the bases, and if you supported your partner with air and with logistics and with everything else you need, you can guide your partner to make the correct decision on the battlefield for themselves and for us. And that's what happened. The Americans kept a low profile, and within a matter of weeks, this is how the battle changed. And Colonel Pat Work had a good expression for it, which he put in a talk I think he gave at West Point, and he told me, and I used it in the book. His sort of philosophy was invest, invest, invest so that you can make a deposit, which is that support your partner. They need something, you be there. They would have these meetings late at night and decide what they're going to do the next day, like at 1 a.m. Okay, adjust to that. Do everything you can to support them and make yourself indispensable for them, so that on some critical occasions you can go to them and say, Saudi, this is our best advice on how you and we can be successful, and this is an instance in which it worked. Last slide, please, Clarissa. This is like, so where are we now? This is where we are now. This thing ain't over. I believe you can count Operation Inherent Resolve as a victory, because the physical caliphate's destroyed. It's greatly diminished. Its influence is much attenuated, but it's not been extinguished. And if you look at the recent report by the Inspector General of the Pentagon that came out just a few weeks ago, attacks are ticking up. ISIS attacks are ticking up a little bit in Syria. Some of it in areas the Americans don't control. And that, since the Russians and the Assad government are first and foremost concerned about attacking opponents of Assad and less concerned about ISIS, they get a little bit of a free ride there. But they're sort of still out there. They're still a factor in Iraq. Hence, the U.S. needs to keep 2,500 troops and roughly 1,000 in Syria on an open-ended basis, so as not to repeat the mistake made in 2011 when we pulled everything out, lost situational awareness of what was going on within our own partner, and then had to return. This is a photo of the last days of Baghouz, the last days of the physical caliphate, and the women who came out there and families. They're now in a hellhole called Hall camp, where there are more than 50,000. And unfortunately, it's become a kind of a den of extremism. There are just some horrible stories you hear, including quite recently, of people who are young people who are not extremists and are, well, there was a report of 2 Egyptian girls who had beheaded by people in the camp, and their arms in the camp, and the SDF's done operations in there to try to clean it out from time to time. But it's a large camp. It's basically ISIS supporters and families who have no place to go or won't be received by the countries from which they came. And it's an open sore in Syria, and there's no good solution for it, along with the other detention camps. Right now, it's being contained, but if there was a larger Turkish intervention, it's not impossible that some of these detention areas and even this camp could that the constraints could break down. So this is a situation that needs attention going forward. So that's all of my slides. And Frank, over to you.
Michael, thank you very much for such a great presentation. We really appreciate it. And we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experience with us. So to kind of just break the ice and questions before we open it up to all the participants, I wanted to kind of expound a little bit on the by, with, and through notion. And I agree with you completely that by, with, and through and the indirect approach, something that was so essential to the conflict against Daesh or ISIS, and is also so central to US SOCOM, has a place in future conflict. It's not going away. But the question I wanted to ask and kind of focus on is, how prepared do you think that the US defense establishment will be to be able to execute it? On the one hand, you have US SOCOM, it's still a key component of it. You have general purpose forces such as the Army that has stood up security force assistance brigades to a debatable level of capability. But on the other hand, as you noted, there's been really no open source history or real deep after review of the by, with, and through strategy within OIR. There certainly is a massive predilection on the defense establishment and general purpose forces to kind of put security force assistance or by, with, and through as kind of a backwater, kind of not unpopular component of their mission set. Where do you think we'll be on this in future conflicts? Do you think we're going to have to kind of reinvent the wheel, or do you think we will be more prepared next time, I guess?
I thank you for that question. I don't really know the answer, but I have some thoughts. I mean, for example, there's SFAB. SFABs have played a role in Europe, particularly in some of the training of the Ukrainians, because I've been on the media roundtables with them where they talk about they've helped the Ukrainians with this, that, or the other kind of technical training. And there's SFABs in Asia trying to do the same. I guess that's all to the good. I mean, I think it's a big army solution for how to do by, with, and through, or advise and assist if the SOF and special forces community is kind of tapped out and there are only limited number of them. But one thing that I've observed is just sort of two things. One, these things are done most effectively when they draw on relationships and prior experience in the region and language skills and things of that sort, which is basically skill set that special operation forces emphasize and embody. And I think that's when they're really most effective. And again, these are relationships that need to be developed in peacetime if you want to draw on them effectively later, because not everything can be entirely transactional, although the entire relationship with the SDF was pioneered by Chris Donahue when he was a Delta Force commander in the early period of the war in 2014, in August 2014, when he met General Mazloum in Sulaymaniyah, a meeting I have in my book. But he wouldn't have been able to do that if the special operations community didn't have ties into all of the Kurds in northern Iraq, including the Kurds in Sulaymaniyah, who brokered that relationship, Lahore Talabani, who I interviewed for this book. So I've not been in the military, but my observation is that we need to maintain these relationships and these deployments and these skills because we can't predict where the next fight is going to be. And I think SFAB can complement that, but I think that the sort of soft community, it needs to play a major role in this. And plus, they have a lot of respect and a great reputation around the world when American SOF comes in too. So they're known. So, that's my answer to that.
Thanks, Michael. So for a second question, I wanted to ask about a topic that is, sensitive among the military, but it is also a really important topic to explore both academically and professionally. And, in Degrade and Destroy, it's very clear that there are serious civil-military relations frictions between the military and both President Obama and then later President Trump. And the question I have, and more recently, we've also seen, for example, the multiple press reports about civil-military relation frictions between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, and President Trump. And so, having covered really the arc of 3 wars and, more than 3 decades of experience covering, that strategic level, that interaction of the military and civilian leadership, do you see that the civil-military relations frictions during OIR, is it really, more of the same, and it's just been kind of the standard civil-military relation frictions that exist in conflict, that kind of that Clausewitz writes about and the Trinity, or has anything changed? Are the frictions more acute? Having covered it from Desert Storm to OIF to OIR.
Well, I think I can certainly explain what I think happened in terms of civil relations during that period. I don't know if it's more acute, but it was there. And they were very different challenges. During the Obama administration, the White House engaged in a great degree of oversight over the strategy and over actually authorities and even operations. Critics would call it micromanagement. There's a great frustration in General Dempsey, according to some of his conversations with CENTCOM Commander Lloyd Austin, where he would say, oh, they're being overly tactical. And they were very tactical. So when it came, for example, to some of the initial blows of the war, what should we do? Should we drop humanitarian supplies to the beleaguered Yazidis and Sinjar? Well, the military wanted to conduct some airstrikes at ISIS outposts then, so that they wouldn't scamper up the mountain and get the supplies. And we're trying to help the Yazidis there. And the concern was raised about that by Susan Rice. Aren't you using force? Are we on a path toward war? But there was a lot of second guessing or scrutiny or oversight. And that's the right and the prerogative of the civilians. And President Obama, he was concerned about not getting drawn in. He didn't want to have boots on the ground. That was the stage, which of course we ended up having to a certain extent with the Expeditionary Targeting Force, as they used to call it. But he didn't want to have boots in the ground. He didn't want U.S. force to be in direct combat. And so there was a lot of tensions over a period of years to get the requisite authorities to properly carry out an advisory mission. In the end, it was more or less granted by the Obama administration, but it took a little doing. So that's my critique of them. I think that the initial approach, President Obama has to be given credit for going back into Iraq. He has to be given credit for picking a model that eventually was successful, certainly. But the initial micromanagement did sap momentum. Under President Trump, he had an entirely different problem, which is he didn't pay attention to these conflicts. He kind of let H.R. McMaster, whomever was national security advisor at the time, kind of run things. But a guy like McMaster also understands he's not going to run the war. So he would delegate it to Mattis, who would delegate it to the theater commanders. So the strategy wasn't changed then. But there was less sort of micromanagement. So, for example, the Topka operation, where they airlifted a large number of SDF fighters in a rather bold effort to deposit them behind enemy lines and take a city west of Raqqa, was if that had happened during the Obama administration, there would have been meeting after meeting to consider the pros and cons and the risks and this and that. Well, none of that occurred in the Trump administration because the White House was not about to take on that mantle. They were going to let these decisions be made by the Pentagon in the field. So in a sense, what happened under President Trump was he executed basically the Obama strategy, but sometimes more efficiently than Obama himself. I mean, toward the end of the Obama administration, there was a rule that there could only be 3 attack helicopters in Syria at one time for 72 hours because they were trying to guard against slipping into a quagmire. All that went away with Trump. On the other hand, because Trump wasn't involved in a lot of these decision-making, he himself lost touch with what was happening in the war. And in a couple of occasions when he ordered troops out of Syria, which was in each case done impulsively, he didn't fully understand the consequences. And the first time, after he ordered troops out and he flew to al-Assad and was briefed on it, I've talked to the people who were there for those briefings. He was rather surprised that the whole thing wasn't done and that Baghouz wasn't taken, that there was months of fighting still ahead, and that if we were to leave immediately, not only would ISIS be intact to some degree, but we'd be leaving behind billions of dollars worth of equipment. And so he reversed himself. So I would say, while President Obama was on one end of the spectrum, perhaps, in terms of his oversight, President Trump was on the other. What you really want is something in the middle.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So I'd like to open to the floor. If you have a question, please either use the raise hand option or type it in the chat box, and then we'll go from there to see who has questions to make it more participatory. I guess, a question I could ask in the interim as people are typing their questions. One is as an author, as a writer, or as a investigator, what was the biggest surprise that you kind of uncovered while researching the book? The biggest moment where you're like, wow, something that, just very either interesting or shocking, or something that caught you off guard that you uncovered as you were both forward, deployed, or as you were doing research afterwards and interviewing people?
Well, they sort of fall into two categories. There's sort of the gee whiz things that, you don't know, and all of these conflicts are very complicated events. And, you think of this one, there's we're advising Iraqi forces that are not just one thing. They're the CTS, the Iraqi army, the federal police, all reporting to different ministries, Kurds of different stripes, the KDP Kurds, the PUK Kurds who don't get along, but are still all part of the Peshmerga. But there were some gee whiz things that I didn't know when I began the book, and I worked on it for like years, 6 years probably all in. I had a day job, but 6 years all in all. And the one is just here's an interesting thing. There was a meeting between Qasem Soleimani and a one-star American general at in the Union 3, the joint headquarters across the street from the American embassy. Somewhat ironic, and I think it was in 2015. He's killed later by the U.S. down, right outside Bayap airport, not so far from there, and that had not been disclosed. And that came out. When you do these books, you interview people multiple times, and it eventually came out. Now, it wasn't a meeting to coordinate. The Iranians were in to help in there to help the Iraqis before we were, but but it was mostly to deconflict. It wasn't at the American initiation. It was that the Iraqis said, "Oh, we have a visitor. We're just going to bring in." The Americans didn't think of it. Oh, shit, Qasem Soleimani. But the conversation occurred, and they discussed the disposition of forces on the battlefield. It was in more spirit of deconfliction. Of course, the relation, which is what our relations with Iran were in the early stage of the war, because we were fighting a common enemy. Obviously, that changed considerably. That's a gee whiz fact. I certainly didn't know before. But there's another one, a more serious one, particularly for this audience. When you think of how did this strategy emerge, and there was Operation Inherent Resolve, and there's a commander, and before Townsend was Sean McFarlane, and there's a whole kind of conventional structure. But really, there was a key element of the strategy was developed that had nothing to do with that structure. And it was pioneered by the SOF community. And it actually became an absolutely essential part of the strategy. I have a chapter on it, which uses the name of the code name of the operation, not any great secret anymore, but was Talon Anvil. And the whole idea of enlisting Mazloum and the YPG forces, astonishingly, emerged in August 2014, very early, right after Mosul Dam was taken back. And as I mentioned earlier, it happened in a meeting between Chris Donahue, now the 18th Airborne Commander, and last man out in Kabul, and did great stuff to help Ukraine and Europe. And Mazloum and his lieutenants, that was brokered by Lahore Talabani. who I interviewed for the book, and he had a lot of time because he was under house arrest at the time. That's Kurdish politics. But the and that happened then, and this whole concept of we're going to work with these guys, and the original concept of telling them, well, we're going to push to the Euphrates and then pivot toward Raqqa. They were going to not go to Manbij because they knew it was a source point for the Turks. That's not how it eventually was implemented. But that whole was developed early on by a U.S. element that was not publicly acknowledged at the time. And it kind of became grafted on to the strategy. And after the effort to rustle up Syrian fighters to General Nagata failed predictably, no fault to General Nagata, but it was flawed from the start in its conception, and the Turks didn't help any. This became the dominant strategy. So I thought that was interesting, that so much of what worked in the war you won't find in too many of the official records, and it was really pioneered by the Soft community, which anticipated it was going to have to go back in before the fall of Mosul.
Great, thank you. So we're starting to have some questions flow in, and so I'll read them from the chat. Just as a note, if anyone does want to engage Michael directly, you're free to use the raise hand option, and you can go back and forth. But the first question we had was from Basir Warayet. Is it possible for the 80-country plus coalition against ISIS to be resurrected, as opposed to mostly relying on one partner? Do you think we have the kind of diplomatic wasta to be able to return to a large coalition?
In the context of ISIS or in the context of other geopolitical situations?
I suspect the question in Basir, if you wanted to, engage, please do. But I do suspect that it's in the context of Daesh, and still the threat that kind of still remains there, kind of as you indicated, that there's almost as the saying goes, embers under ashes, right? That it's not been fully extinguished.
Well,
indeed, it's kind of like putting all the eggs in one basket, because 10 years ago, when there was the interest in involving with partners in the Middle East and so forth. I mean, I'm from Turkey, so very familiar with the actors and partners that could possibly be engaged, and I guess partners that would try to schmooze with the US. And obviously, when you weigh in SDG, YPG, you could imagine the Turkish view, but it's just our 80 countries more as not as good as YPG. So perhaps diversifying, or basically diversifying the portfolio, both on ISIS but also any other emerging risk, because it's definitely going to be producing more risks vis-a-vis Iran, and because they are always up to no good. Thank you, sir.
Well, if I fully understand the question, so there's some, obviously Syria is a very difficult situation now. There's no diplomacy underway. The Biden administration does not make Syria a priority. They hardly ever talk about it, but they're not taking troops out either. So it's just continued to be a fraught situation. There's continuing skirmishing with Iran. And it was unfortunately the U.S. under President Trump that turned away from stabilization in Syria, because the story is President Trump read an article in the Washington Post how the U.S. is spending $100 million or something on stabilization, which meant demining or restoring essential services. It didn't mean reconstruction, and then canceled it. And then Brett McGurk had to run around the Middle East and get the Saudis to pony up a little bit, which they became more interested in doing as after the Khashoggi effort. It's important to have a coalition. That said, if you look at the fighting coalition, it's the Americans, it's the Brits, it's the French. I saw some Germans and Italians doing some training. They're not 80 nations fighting in this war. There was a nominal Arab participation in the air war in Syria, which was primarily symbolic, and then they all lost interest and decided to focus on Yemen. So the actual coalition, when it comes to the fighting one, is smaller. And in terms of the YPG, they did indeed turn out to be the only force capable of taking on ISIS at the time. The Turkish military wasn't capable of that, Erdogan boasts notwithstanding. And that's how that came to be. And so now we're stuck with this complicated situation of the U.S. is a partner of the SDF, and yet Turkey's a NATO ally and an important player in the region. A little too neutral for my taste between the U.S. and Russia and the conflict with Ukraine, but it's something that has to be kind of navigated. So yeah, there should be a large coalition. There's a pretty good coalition on Ukraine now that's been put together to supply arms for them. To a certain extent, I hate to say it, but to a certain extent, the ISIS campaign has faded in from public consciousness, and I don't think the politicians think about it a great deal either. And one of the principal longer-term dangers is going to come from Iraqi politics and the kind of leadership Iraq has turned to now, which is pretty close to Iran, and which may not want the Americans to stay there. And if the Americans leave, then I don't see a whole lot of good things happening in that part of the world. And I also don't see the Americans making a second return.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, Michael, the questions are certainly flowing in now. So from Ray Devons, he said, thank you for the great discussion on OIR. His question is, in your opinion, how much of the presence of the Iranian-aligned PMF, Popular Mobilization Forces, Hashd-e-Sha'bi, as part of the Iraqi forces caused our senior U.S. civilian and DoD leadership to not allow you and our soft advisors to kind of embed? Basically looking at that, our long fraught relationship with Iran, how did that kind of impact the decision to embed as well as the conflict writ large?
Yeah, I don't think that the two are connected in any way. One quick thing for your audience. One of the unique features of the Wall Street Journal, where I've been at 5 years after my 32 years at the New York Times, is when you write an online article, they put your email at the bottom of it, which makes for some interesting reader mail, but it also means my email's public. So if after this event, anybody wants to reach out to me, it's just my name, Michael, michael.gordon@wsj.com. And that's how we're known to the universe. On the embedding and on the Hashd-e-Sha'bi. So, I was going around Iraq on my own, and I had actually been down in Karbala and the Najaf. In I guess 2015, I went with Al-Khoi. People were close to the clerics there. And so I sort of, Hashd-e-Sha'bi, the PMF run the spectrum from Iranian-backed anti-American elements. So they run the spectrum from the kind of Iranian-backed elements to what they call sort of loyal Hashid, folks who might revere Sistani and this and that. They actually offered me a chance to embed with them. I was a little reluctant to do that because when you do that, your own security is only as good as, I don't know how serious it was, but they said, come with us. It's a bunch of guys in pickup trucks driving to Beijing. And, your security is only as good as the people you're with. And if they're not that proficient, you're going to be in trouble too. They had no American air support. The U.S. drew the line at that. Embedding with the Kurds and the CTS had its challenges because they went beyond the advisors, and there was no medevac for that either. But at least you were the people more closely aligned with the Americans. I think the thing on embedding, they said at the time that they just didn't have the staff to do it. We had a small footprint there, but there's a reluctance on the part of current leadership of the government to be transparent about things and to let the media in. It seems to be a policy that you see in both parties, Democratic as well as Republican administrations. I don't see any reason why they prevented me from betting with the 82nd Airborne last January or February when they went over there. They weren't doing anything there except standing up for NATO and sending a deterrent message and maybe preparing to help with refugees. But if your goal is to manipulate the media as much as possible and control the message, which seems to be the goal of all administrations, I guess that's the path they took. That I think the policy is short-sighted because the military has a recruiting challenge now, and the more that's written about the military and its culture and what it does, and and the better. And also, when the media has a chance to be with the military, it can write in a more informed way about what the military actually does. So I think the Pentagon is shooting itself in the foot by precluding the kind of coverage that would provide American public with a better understanding of the importance of the U.S. military.
Okay, a question from Gabriel Coral. Could you expand on the tension between political and tactical risk? The question's from a MARSOC audience with direct involvement in OIR. They agree that the politically driven tactical risk constrained momentum on the front end of the conflict. Risk aversion, particularly regarding U.S. casualties, continues to persist. Is this the Vietnam and Somalia syndrome kind of baked into our collective consciousness? How do we bridge the divide, particularly with political decision makers, to strike a better balance?
It's a good question. I mean, if I fully understand it, and there were risk averse in the beginning, and also there were some conditions for U.S. reinvolvement in Iraq. President Obama wasn't going to come to the aid of the Iraqis until they replaced Nouri al-Maliki, who I did interview for this book too, and he had to go, and they had to be a new diverse, so to speak, or unified government, and Abadi was a far better leader for Iraq and then Maliki, of all people, who's still a factor in Iraqi politics. So that was trying to make sure that when we got back in Iraq, that it was under a certain set of political conditions. My view on certainly administrations don't want to see American casualties for political reasons. I mean, when I was at the New York Times, I would think, what's the story? And I don't mean to be too cynical, but there's an accident in India and 1,000 people die. Okay, that's a story. Or there's something happens in Europe and 50 people die, or one American serviceman gets killed. So, that's where the threshold is in terms of kind of the public debate here. And in fact, I wrote the first story about the Delta rescue mission in Hawija, which led to the first U.S. combat death in Iraq with Master Sergeant Wheeler. I was out in Iraq at the time. But I think my own view is that the American public has a more sophisticated view of casualties than I think our politicians do. And if you go to the public and say, look, we're taking casualties, but this is why. It's in the service of this strategy. And this strategy is necessary because these aims are important. They will accept that. And if they believe that, yes, casualties are being incurred, but the operation is well managed and is necessary, I think the American public, the record shows that the American public accepts it. Look at all the casualties we took in Iraq, more than 4,000. Look at the casualties we took in Afghanistan, more than 2,000. Was the American public clamoring for us to leave either of those countries? Not really. These were, whether it was the right decision or the wrong decision to leave Afghanistan, it was the president's decision. People in the military have different views about it, but I don't think people would have been marching in the street if we had forces in Afghanistan and were taking 10 casualties a year, if they thought the operation was well managed, the goals were in nation's interest, and it was worth it. So I give the public, I think the public shouldn't be sold short here. I think, political calculations are sometimes made differently.
Yeah, also some comments that have come in, for example, from South Africa. It's my first JSOU webinar. Can't overstate the importance of relationships. In the AFRICOM AOR, this has very little resources, such as assigned forces, but relationships and persistent engagements are just critical. There's some other questions. For example, question from Daniel. Basically, the question is, when the United States left in 2011, the explanation that was given, one of the core explanations that was given, was that the status of forces agreement was not approved. The Iraqi government could not, parliament could not come to agreement on a SOFA. But when we returned in 2014, as believe indicated, there's still no SOFA, and probably still no SOFA as we have forces still there today. What happened?
So I deal with this both at the end of my third book, The End Game with General Trainer, and also at the start of Degrade and Destroy, because I was deeply, deeply into reporting all of this for the New York Times and also for my books. And what essentially happened, and I'll boil it down because it's a little bit of a complicated story, but what happened is the following. When President George W. Bush concluded the SOFA with Iraq, that we could stay until 2011, and that was a successful SOFA, the expectation on the part of some of the negotiators, people like David Satterfield, for example, who later rose to be ambassador in Turkey and played an important role, was that when 2011 came around, we would just come up with some kind of executive agreement or amendment or something to extend it. In other words, you wouldn't try to negotiate a whole new one from scratch. When the Obama administration came in, it was agnostic about retaining American forces in Iraq. That was a strategic miscalculation on the part of the Obama administration, because they didn't understand that it was, at least in the White House, that it was in the American interests, not just the Iraqi interests, to maintain some kind of presence there, just in case things went south as they did. But in any event, they were willing to stay, but they decided to negotiate a whole new SOFA. They didn't give it very much time. They started in June of 2011. We gave far more time to negotiating an agreement in Afghanistan. And it got hung up on the following issue. The Iraqis were willing to let U.S. troops stay, but Maliki didn't want to take the agreement to the parliament. He didn't want to have a big fight there where he had postured himself as the strong man of Iraq, and he didn't want to have to go before the Sadrs and others and fight for keeping the Americans there. And he told the Americans point blank, he was willing to sign an executive agreement. He was willing to do whatever, but he wasn't willing to take it to the parliament. And indeed, when George Bush got his SOFA, he did not require the Iraqis to go to the parliament. And people like Ryan Crocker and Brett McGurk, who was assisting the Obama people at the time, did not think it was a wise course of action or that it would be productive. Be that as it may, that was the deal breaker. It was the assistance that, and Jim Jeffrey was then ambassador at the time, supported it, said, look, if you're a Democratic government, there were two schools of thought, and we're going to have a SOFA, this needs to be approved by your parliament, or else we don't think the protections and the legal immunities and all this thing will stick in the view of our lawyers. Another view was, hey, we shouldn't be telling these people what they need to do in their system. They're willing to sign an agreement. They just don't want to take it to the parliament, because it's politically difficult. I would note that the JCPOA, which we concluded with Iran, was not taken to the American parliament by the Obama administration because they didn't think they'd approve it. So sometimes governments do things like that. Anyway, the thing faltered. Maliki and Obama were not close. They talked precisely twice during the whole history of the SOFA talks, one to start them and one to end them. And so there was no interaction at the leader level in between. Both men misjudged the situation. Both thought that Iraqis could handle it on their own. Wiser Iraqis knew better. And so things went south and the Americans came back in. The questioner is absolutely right. There was no SOFA. But what does that show you? It shows you that when an administration is ambivalent about doing something, it can raise a high legal bar and say, well, unless this bar is satisfied, we're not going to be there. And when it needs to do something, it can lower that legal bar and do it anyway. And that's what happened when our forces returned. Now, I interviewed Hoshar Zebari, who was then foreign minister of Iraq, and he's still an important figure out there. And he wrote some sort of thing as foreign minister saying that the advisors that were being deployed would have all the protections that were necessary, and I think equivalent to diplomats or some such thing. He did it on his own authority. You can see whatever legal standing you think that has. The Iraqi prime minister wasn't even aware he did that, but he did it to try to provide a little bit of kind of a buffer there. But yes, I mean, I think that the SOFA talks in Iraq were mishandled by the politicians on both sides. The generals on both sides knew better, to include Lloyd Austin, who wanted to keep more than 20,000 troops there as the last Iraq commander. And when we had to go back in, we went in without a formal SOFA, and nor do we have one to this day. But it's not an issue because the way we're operating within bases, we're not occupying Iraq. We're assisting the Iraqi army and in mentoring them and carrying out their mission. By the way, I would like to point out, I just read this IG report out of the Pentagon, and our current mission in Iraq, even with 2,500 troops, is not quite as effective as some people might think. For example, there's a little section there on Iraqi logistics that it continues to be a sore point and a weakness, always has been. And there was just a paragraph in there saying, well, we don't, the way we've constructed this mission, we don't really have anybody down there working their logistics and helping them with that. And there are some other similar examples. So while we have a presence in Iraq now, the authorities are pretty constrained, and it's there's still areas of weakness in the Iraqi forces, including some that we're not directly addressing.
Okay. From, I believe, Clarence Willis Donnelly, as a journalist, did you encounter any significant challenges in either accessing information or people while interacting with the military during this book?
Yes, all the time. It continues to this day. I mean, that's just the nature of the relationship. I mean, some people were extremely helpful and forthcoming, and some people weren't. And the problem is even worse with the civilians. But when you do a book, one thing I have to say, it's an enormous amount of work. You don't do it for the money, because there isn't a lot of money. Not in this kind of book. You have to do it because you think it's worth doing, and it fills a gap, and because you're interested in the subject matter, and you think there should be a book about it. But you know, when I would go to people and say, listen, this is for a book, it's going to come out in like a few years. It's not anything you're doing now is going to be history by the time this book comes out. And it does facilitate conversations. And so some of what I was able to access as an author doing research went beyond what I would have been able to access as a journalist who was writing about an article for the next day's newspaper, simply because people are likely to be a little more forthcoming if you're writing for the historical record, and if there's a bit of distance between the conversation and the product, and also if it's a product that's built on hundreds of interviews and oral histories and things, not just on any one person. But yeah, there is that tension that's just baked into our system.
A question from George Shannon. With the Russian unprovoked war in Ukraine, coupled with their dire need for manpower there, what does their footprint look like in Syria currently, supporting Assad? And what do you portend for the future of their operations there?
So I'm not a soothsayer, but I was in one of my previous incarnations, I was New York Times bureau chief in Russia, and well, for 4 years I was in Russia, and then 1999 I was the bureau chief, and Vladimir Putin became prime minister, and the Second Chechen War coincided with those responsibilities, and later became president. And that's not a coincidence. Other Russian figures were more cautious about taking all of Chechnya. And what I observed then, by the way, was much of what I see now, which is that a Russian military that was a sort of a blunderbuss approach to using force, that was heavy on firepower, that didn't do a whole lot of maneuver, that couldn't do air and ground integration, that had a lot of what they called they had conscripts and then contractniki, so-called professional soldiers, but they're not professional soldiers the way you people are. They're just people who get paid money to be in the military and officers. And they destroyed Grozny. I was there for a lot of that. I wrote a New York Times article, the first paragraph of which the Russians didn't conquer Grozny, they destroyed it. After they destroyed it, they rebuilt it. So when there was all this talk about the Russian military is going to be at the gates of Kiev in 3 days, which came from our leaders of the Pentagon, I thought, this must be some different military than I'm acquainted with. Has Gerasimov transformed this force magically? And doesn't it kind of, isn't its DNA the same, even if they have some new weapons? So that's who they are. And it was instructive to sort of see that in action. That said, it's sort of looking forward at this thing. I don't see, this is authoritarian regime with Putin, and I don't see him yielding Crimea or some of the territory in the east. I don't see any sense he's interested in negotiating about it. He'll double down. That's his nature. General Milley said yesterday in a Pentagon press conference, the Ukrainians don't have the wherewithal to take Crimea back anyway. I'm sure the Ukrainians didn't appreciate that, but he said it twice now, General Milley, so that's his view. And but it may be true. And so I think the Russians are going to try to hold on there and play a long game. They're destroying Ukraine's infrastructure and and heat sources and electricity sources. I think it's going to be a test of wills going forward. It doesn't seem to have impacted too much their operation in Syria. They've reallocated an S-300 system from Syria, I think, to the theater in Ukraine, but they still have some forces in Syria, enough that the Israelis are reluctant to give weapons to Ukraine because they need to deconflict all of their airstrikes against the Iranians and Iranian elements with the Russians, which is what lies behind that. General Grinkovich, who's the AFCENT commander, did say some interesting things recently at the AFA convention, and you can also read them in Air and Space Force magazine by a young reporter named Chris Gordon, who covered those events. And what he said was that the Russian forces in Syria have become more belligerent in the air. Now, there's not direct hostilities, but there are more episodes of trying to be cowboys with the American Air Force in the air, which you have to take note of. Nothing too terrible has happened so far. And they've also stopped notifying transport flights. They used to notify when they flew near the Entente garrison, and they stopped doing that just to be difficult about it. So there's increased sort of tensions with the Russians in Syria, which had been kind of managed through this deconfliction line, but so far no hostilities there, and so far still a significant enough presence that makes them a factor in that country.
Great. From Captain Patrick Burns, would you characterize OIR as a case study of a successful counterterrorism operation or strategy? I feel the way Afghanistan ended left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths, but OIR feels like an operation we can point to and say we had succeeded conducting counterterrorism.
Yes, and that's how I explain it in the book. You know, when I started covering it, the thing was still going on. And when I started writing the book, it was still going on. And the reason the book took so long is it took a while for this to happen, because first Mosul, then you had to get to Raqqa, and who knows what was Trump going to do? Was he going to finish the job? We're going to arm the YPG. We're not going to arm the YPG. There were so many things that had to happen before I could finish the book that affected the conduct of the war. It was a successful operation. And so not everything America touches goes wrong. Sometimes we do things right, and it was successful in that ISIS, while not obliterated, with the physical caliphate, was just destroyed. It's been whittled down to size. The number of casualties, combat deaths on the American side were 20. I think that was about what we had in Just Cause, which was the first wars that I covered. There were some warts on it. Civilian casualties were pretty high. That's a concern going forward, how to mitigate that. Some of that is hard to do because our proxy partner forces required a lot of air to move forward, or else they didn't move. There are things that went right and things that went wrong. But yes, we accomplished that. OIR was a success, and it ought to be kept in mind when we look at Afghanistan, which can only be considered as a strategic failure.
Okay, from Mr. Wadayet. First of all, Back in December 2019, it was detected that groups of Iranians were conducting surveillance inside a European airport, probably IRGC or Quds Force. Did Qasem Soleimani have an appetite to mount terrorist attacks against civil aviation?
I simply don't know.
Okay.
I don't know that. I do know that relationships with Iran are pretty fraught. There was just a scare a little while ago about the Saudis seemed persuaded they might be another attack like Abqaiq, and that's going to be a difficult thing going forward. But I don't know about that.
And then I think perhaps the last question, unless anyone has additional questions. Sir, you're a highly experienced and wise journalist. Are younger journalists also sharing the same interest in reporting out of high threat environments? Is the trend line changing on reporting from conflict zones, or is it still of interest?
Well, I would answer this one in a two-part way. Sure. I mean, look at Ukraine. I mean, there are a lot of reporters in Ukraine, and the Wall Street Journal has a very dedicated and extremely proficient team there, to include Yaroslav Trofimov, who speaks Ukrainian. People, we have Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers. They've been in there all along. The American embassy left, but Wall Street Journal didn't leave. Neither did the New York Times. They stayed. Other media stayed. The American government then came back. The journalists were there the whole time. They never went anywhere. So even when people thought the Russians were going to surround Kyiv and somehow march into the city, there was a media presence there with security, and we have our security protocols and advisors and all that sort of thing. So yes, there is still an interest in that. I think that's manifest. What I would like to see, but it's not my job to make it happen, would be for journalists to have the opportunities that I did in OIF and the invasion of Iraq, to embed and be with U.S. forces and get a better understanding of how the military works. I mean, because I think that's important. It's you can't just cover it from the Pentagon briefing room, and covering conflict. You can cover how the Ukrainians fight, but it's good to be with the Americans. There's still some of those opportunities. I mean, I went on a B-52 and the Chinese A-Diz a couple of years ago for 12-hour flight, and that's interesting. And during Kosovo, I went up in an airplane when they didn't call it embedding then, but I was in an AB-CCC. You can go on a ship, but I feel like it'd be better you can go, I was at Project Convergence 22 and Fort Irwin last week. And, you can see some things there and interact with people who are working on future war and JAD-C2 and things of that nature. But I feel like the military needs to improve recruiting. It doesn't get all the respect that it deserves in American society. Yes, people pay homage to it at sporting events, but not a lot of people really understand how it operates and what it is. We all know that the number of people who serve is limited. I never served, but it's limited. A lot of Americans don't know much about it. And so I would hope that going forward, there could, reintroduce this process of including American correspondence with U.S. forces and conflict environments, or even just in deterrence environments. When you go in, you don't just, they can't tell you what to write, but there's an understanding that you're not going to write about future operations, and there's some basic guidelines that are observed. And my experience is, by and large, that those are observed. I don't want to say those things aren't happening, because I think I have a colleague now who's doing something along these lines that he negotiated himself, but it's not as extensive as it would be. But I can't really speak to what where the younger journalism is going these days, because so much of it's focused on politics and Twitter and things of that sort that I pay less attention to.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Did you want to have any kind of concluding comments?
Not really. I mean, I am, I'm just an observer. I'm not a practitioner. I don't do these things. I just watch other people do these things, but I do try to understand them as best I can. And I covered the State Department for 4 years, and I've never been a diplomat, but I would go on the plane and go to negotiations and try to write about how those unfolded. And covering the military is not so different. The last thing I would just simply say is I gave you folks my email. I mean that seriously, because I don't have the answers to all these things, and I don't always know what the emerging issues are. I'm always looking for things to write about, like what are the important questions now for the military? Where's the military going now? I'm focusing a lot on China, Russia, great power competition, NDS implementation. How is the military changing? How does it need to change? What is it doing? I'm interested in all of those things, including in the soft community. I went to Robin Sage last summer, saw that, resistance training, this, that, and the like. So I'm interested in the culture of the military, how it's changing to deal with things, recognizing that the world's unpredictable. And so I'm open if anybody has interesting ideas for stories, projects, things that the Wall Street Journal should be digging into. It's a serious newspaper. I'm on the reporting side, not the editorial side. I have nothing to do with the editorials, either the Journal or the New York Times. So I'm just an empiricist. I'm interested in all of that. I haven't yet figured out what a next book might be if I summon up the courage to do that, but I'm trying to think that through too. So I really welcome the opportunity to do this. And Frank, thank you. Now, when I first met Frank, he wasn't a doctor, but now he's a doctor. So that's an important accomplishment too. And I appreciate you hosting this event.
Thank you again so much, Michael. It's been really great to have you here, and we really appreciate all of your insight, knowledge, wisdom. And then, again, just to throw in one more kind of thought, read Michael's books. If you want to understand Iraq, they are absolutely the definitive explanation of the American involvement in Iraq since the 1980s and 1990s. So with that, we'll close. Thank you very much, Michael. And we look forward to hopefully hosting you again in the future.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks.